Hello and welcome. I know many of you use these videos to help you fall asleep. So before we begin, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment where you're from and at what time you're watching. Take a moment to get comfortable, relax, and let yourself unwind. It was late, much later than he had planned, when Ryan finally stood on the empty platform. His watch read 12:15 a.m., the glow of the dim lights above flickering slightly, casting long shadows on the cracked concrete. The last train to Blackwood was the only one running this late. He had missed the earlier ones, he wasn't sure why. Something about the workday had dragged on, and now, here he was, waiting for the final train. The station was eerily quiet, save for the occasional whistle of the wind that slipped through the gaps between the walls. There was no one else around, just Ryan, standing under the weak station lights, holding his breath against the chill in the air. He checked his phone, but there were no new messages. No missed calls. No reminders. As if on cue, the sound of metal wheels on steel tracks filled the air. A rumble in the distance, low and deep, grew louder with each passing second until the train appeared at the end of the platform. It was a long train, with its windows reflecting the faint light from the station, giving it an almost otherworldly look. The doors slid open with a soft hiss, and Ryan stepped inside, his shoes tapping against the cold, polished floor. He looked around. The train was almost completely empty. Just a few scattered seats, some lit by the flickering overhead lights. There was one person in the far corner of the car, an older man, hunched over with a brown, worn coat. His face was hidden, the shadows obscuring most of it, and his hands rested on the small bag he held in his lap. Ryan picked an empty seat near the center of the train, far from the stranger. The door slid shut with another hiss, and the train began to move. The sound of the tracks outside rumbled, smooth and constant. The rhythmic noise of the train rolling along was oddly soothing, even though the setting felt wrong. He tried to shrug off the unease creeping up his spine, but it lingered, tightening around him as the train pulled further into the dark night. Outside the windows, nothing but blackness greeted him. It was as if the world had vanished, leaving only the train on an endless path through a void. The occasional flash of light outside, far-off street lamps, perhaps, was quickly swallowed by the darkness. The train seemed to be moving faster than it should, but Ryan couldn't place why it felt so wrong. He glanced at the old man again, but this time, the man's head was turned slightly. Ryan could make out only his face, a pale, gaunt face with hollow eyes. For a moment, their eyes locked. The older man didn't smile or nod. He simply stared, his expression unreadable. Ryan quickly looked away. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, staring at the darkened window instead. But as he tried to focus on the outside, something caught his eye, a subtle change in the scenery. The flicker of lights, the silhouette of trees, the occasional shadow. It was all wrong. The images outside seemed to distort, bending and shifting, as if the landscape was being twisted in some way. A chill ran through Ryan's body. He was sure he had seen a familiar street light outside the window just a moment ago, but now it was gone. It was replaced by a stretch of woods, thick trees that seemed to crowd in on the train. The tracks weren't supposed to run through a forest. There were no forests on this line. The sound of the old man shifting in his seat broke the tension. Ryan turned to look at him, but the man had already begun to speak. His voice was low, raspy, as though he hadn't spoken in a long time. "Are you lost?" the man asked, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. Ryan blinked, momentarily taken aback. "What?" he asked, not entirely sure how to respond. The man didn't seem like the type to ask casual questions. "I can see it in your eyes," the man continued, leaning slightly forward. His gaze was intense now, focused. "You're not supposed to be on this train." Ryan swallowed, his mouth dry. I'm just going to Blackwood." The man's lips twitched into something like a smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Blackwood, huh? You won't find it there, not anymore. Ryan frowned, uncertain of what the old man meant. What do you mean? The train goes to Blackwood, doesn't it? The old man's eyes glinted strangely in the dim light. Not anymore. This train doesn't go to Blackwood anymore. Not in the way you think. A nervous laugh escaped Ryan's lips. Are you joking? He didn't like how the conversation was turning. He wanted to turn his attention back to the window, but that feeling, that wrongness, kept pulling him back. The scenery outside had changed again. This time, the woods were gone, replaced by an open field with a single, crooked building standing in the distance. I'm not joking, son, the old man said, his voice lowering to a near whisper. You should never have gotten on. You're not going to Blackwood. No one is. Not anymore. Ryan felt his stomach tighten. Something in the man's words settled deep in his bones, filling him with a sense of dread he couldn't shake. What do you mean? Where's this train even going? He tried to keep his voice steady, but it cracked at the edges. The old man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at Ryan with those hollow eyes, as if measuring something inside him. Finally, he spoke again, his voice even quieter. This train, it only goes one place. And once you're on, you never get off. Ryan's heart raced, and his breath quickened. He was suddenly aware of how alone he felt on the train, the eerie silence of the night pressing in on him. He could feel the old man's eyes on him, but the words, those terrible words, hung in the air like a thick fog. The world outside the train had become an unsettling blur, shifting in ways he couldn't quite understand. You're not making any sense, Ryan said, forcing himself to speak, though his voice trembled. He stood up from his seat and walked a few paces down the aisle, his eyes flicking nervously toward the windows. The old man didn't follow him. He remained seated, his gaze unwavering. You can try to get off, he muttered, his voice colder now. But you won't. You'll never leave. Ryan stopped in his tracks, his pulse pounding in his ears. The train had slowed down, or so it seemed. It felt like it was crawling, despite the occasional jolts that made it seem as though it was still picking up speed. He turned to look out the window again. The landscape had changed once more. Now the train was passing through a desolate, abandoned town. The buildings were old and crumbling, their windows boarded up, their doors hanging off their hinges. The streetlights flickered weakly, casting long, haunting shadows on the cracked pavement. It looked like the kind of place where no one had lived for years. This isn't right, Ryan muttered under his breath, his heart thudding in his chest. He pressed his hand against the window, feeling the coldness of the glass beneath his fingertips, and then turned back to the old man. You said this train doesn't go to Blackwood. So where is it going? Ryan asked, his voice shaking more than he intended. The old man gave a long, drawn-out sigh, his eyes narrowing in that strange, knowing way. It goes to places forgotten, places that shouldn't be remembered, places that disappear. Ryan felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He didn't understand what the old man meant, but every instinct inside him screamed to leave, to run, to get off this train before it was too late. Suddenly, the train lurched, jerking forward with such force that Ryan almost lost his balance. The whole car creaked, the lights flickering as if the entire train was struggling to stay in motion. The old man's head snapped to the side, his eyes wide and alert. Do you feel it? The old man asked, his voice strained, almost fearful. It's here. Ryan's stomach churned. The air around him seemed to grow heavier, colder. He could feel a shift in the atmosphere, something ancient and dark tugging at the edges of his mind. The train slowed again, but this time it wasn't stopping. It felt like it was grinding to a halt, like something was preventing it from moving any further. Ryan glanced out the window once more. The town outside had faded, and in its place was a vast, empty stretch of land. The tracks ahead disappeared into a thick fog, an unnatural fog that had risen up from nowhere. The air outside seemed to thicken as well, as though something was wrapping itself around the train, keeping it locked in place. Why isn't it moving? Ryan asked, his voice rising. Why aren't we stopping? The old man stood up slowly, his eyes still fixed on the thick fog outside. We're not stopping. Not until it wants us to. Ryan felt a sinking feeling in his stomach, a heavy dread creeping up his spine. He knew the old man was talking about something terrible, something that wasn't right, but he couldn't understand it. He had to escape. The train suddenly jerked forward again, snapping Ryan from his thoughts. The lights flickered violently, and for a moment, everything went dark. The sudden darkness was so complete, so absolute, that Ryan couldn't even see his own hands in front of his face. Then a strange, cold whisper filled the air, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere, from nowhere at all. "It's time!" The whisper lingered, crawling beneath his skin, wrapping around his heart, squeezing it with an unbearable pressure. Ryan's breath caught in his throat as the train began to move again, but this time it was different. The speed at which it traveled felt unnatural, almost inhuman. Outside the windows, the fog thickened, swallowing the landscape entirely. There was nothing left to see, just a rolling, endless white. And then, through the fog, Ryan thought he saw something, shapes, figures, moving toward the train. Shadows shifting, coming closer. He couldn't make out what they were, but they were there, moving just outside the train's reach. Figures that were tall, too tall, with limbs that didn't seem right, and faces that were twisted, distorted by the fog. Ryan took a step back, his mind racing. "What are they?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the train's movement. The old man didn't answer at first. He simply watched the figures approach, his face pale, his hands trembling. "They're the ones who never left," he said finally, his voice strained. "They're the ones who are still here. The ones who didn't escape." Ryan's chest tightened. His breath became shallow, the air growing colder and colder. The fog outside seemed to press against the train, like it was trying to suffocate him. He turned to run, his legs unsteady beneath him, but before he could take more than 2 steps, the train came to a sudden stop. The car jolted forward, throwing him off balance. He fell to the floor with a heavy thud, the wind knocked from his lungs. There was silence, complete and utter silence. Ryan lay on the floor, gasping for air. He could feel the cold against his skin, but the air no longer felt real. It felt like the world itself had stopped moving. His heart raced in his chest as he pushed himself up, his palms sweaty. Slowly he stood, his legs unsteady. He turned to look at the old man, but the man was gone. The seat where he had been sitting was empty. The train car was empty. Not a single person in sight. Ryan's mind was reeling. He stumbled back, his heart pounding so violently in his chest that it felt like it might burst. The air around him felt thick, suffocating, as though the walls of the train car were closing in. He rushed to the door, his hands shaking as he gripped the cold metal handle. With a forceful twist, he yanked it open. Nothing. The door led into another car, just like the one he had been in, empty, quiet, and unsettling. He slammed the door shut again, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. A low hum filled the air, the only sound left in the train. The soft whir of the train's engine, the rhythm of the wheels on the tracks. It all felt wrong. He turned back toward the interior of the car. The seats were still empty, the lights overhead flickering weakly. There was nothing but the low hum of the train and the oppressive silence, which seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. Ryan's gaze darted to the windows. The fog outside was thicker than ever, swirling around the train like a living thing. He could see shadows, shapes moving just beyond the glass, just out of reach. His breath fogged the window as he pressed his hand against it, desperate for any sign of something familiar, something that might assure him he wasn't trapped in some nightmare. But there was nothing. No streetlights, no buildings, no landmarks, just a swirling white fog that seemed to stretch on forever. A low creak from the back of the train broke his focus. His head whipped around, his body frozen in place. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate creak from somewhere in the rear of the car. As if something, Someone was moving through the darkened passageways. Without thinking, Ryan rushed down the aisle, the tension in his muscles so tight it felt like he might snap. His feet echoed in the quiet, the sound of his own footsteps unnervingly loud against the silence. He reached the door at the end of the car and grabbed the handle, his fingers slick with sweat. He pulled it open and stopped. The passageway beyond was empty, dark, stretching into the unknown. Ryan took a hesitant step forward, then another, moving slowly as if the very act of walking might disturb the fragile stillness around him. Each step felt like a violation of the silence, each breath a betrayal of the quiet that had fallen over the train. And then the whisper came again, a soft, cold voice like a breath on his ear, so faint that it could have been his imagination. But it wasn't. He heard it clearly, a warning, barely audible but unmistakable. "It's too late." Ryan froze. The words hung in the air, thick with dread. He turned around quickly, but there was nothing behind him. The car was empty, still just like before. His pulse raced. He couldn't explain it, but the feeling, the pressure in the air, was stronger now. Like the train was no longer just a train. It was something else, something alive. He stepped back toward the front of the train, but before he could even reach the door, the lights flickered violently. The train lurched again, as though it were about to break apart. The whole car shuddered, and Ryan stumbled forward, nearly falling to the ground. The walls seemed to ripple, warping in a way that made his stomach lurch. Outside the windows, the fog had become impenetrable, completely consuming the train, swallowing it whole. The shadows, those shapes, were back, moving closer. There was no telling what they were, but they were coming, drawing closer, faster, their forms shifting with unnatural speed. They were so close now that Ryan could almost hear the faintest scraping sound, like nails dragging across glass. He couldn't breathe. His head was spinning, his vision blurred with panic. There was no way out, no escape. The train was moving too fast, and the landscape had become nothing more than a swirling, chaotic mess of fog and shadow. The doors were locked, the windows sealed. He was trapped. "Please," Ryan whispered to himself, though he wasn't sure who he was pleading with. His hands gripped the nearest seat, his knuckles white. "I need to get off. I have to get off." A sudden crash from the back of the train startled him. Ryan spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. There, at the far end of the car, the door to the next compartment had been forced open. A figure, tall and cloaked in shadow, stood in the doorway. It was just a silhouette, the edges of its form blurred and undefined by the thick fog that poured in from behind. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. The temperature in the car dropped, and a deep, oppressive silence followed the figure's every step. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He was frozen, his feet rooted to the floor as the figure moved closer, its form becoming clearer with every step. It was the old man, but not the same old man. The one who had spoken to him earlier, the one who had warned him about Blackwood. This version was different. His face was pale, deathly so, and his eyes were wide and hollow, like two black voids staring into Ryan's very soul. His skin was pulled tight, stretched over his bones, and there was something unnatural about the way his limbs moved. They were stiff, jerky, like a marionette on strings. The old man smiled, but it wasn't a smile. It was a grimace, a twisted pull of the lips that sent a jolt of terror through Ryan. "You're not supposed to be here," the old man said, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't the same voice Ryan had heard before. This one was deeper, rougher, more insistent. Ryan took a step back, but the train lurched again, its wheels screeching against the tracks in a way that made his teeth rattle. He lost his balance and fell hard to the floor, his head slamming against the cold metal. Dazed, he tried to push himself up, but his vision blurred, and the old man was there, standing over him. "You can't leave," the old man whispered, his voice sending a chill down Ryan's spine. "No one ever leaves." Ryan's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't make sense of the words, couldn't understand what was happening. But one thing was clear. He had made a terrible mistake getting on this train. The question was, would he make it off? Ryan scrambled to his feet, his head still spinning from the fall. His mind raced, trying to comprehend what was happening. The train was moving again, but this time it felt different. The vibrations beneath his feet were wrong, uneven, like the train was being dragged through thick, unseen forces. The old man loomed over him, his eyes unblinking, his smile stretched too far. It was as if he knew something Ryan couldn't see, something far worse than the fog and shadows outside. "No one ever leaves," the old man repeated, his voice hollow and cold, echoing in Ryan's ears. "Not from Blackwood." Ryan's breath hitched. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. Panic clutched at his throat like a vice. The door behind him, he had to reach the door. The door to the next car. He had to get away from this thing, this whatever it was. Ignoring the throbbing pain in his skull, he bolted toward the door, his feet stumbling over the uneven floor. He had to get out. He had to. But the old man's hand shot out, grabbing his arm with surprising strength. Ryan gasped as the old man's grip tightened, his bony fingers digging into his skin like claws. "You think you can escape?" the old man sneered, his lips curling. "There's no escaping Blackwood. It takes what it wants. And it wants you." Ryan fought to pull away, but the old man's hold was ironclad. His chest was tight with fear, and the world around him was warping. The train lurched again, the lights flickering wildly as the walls of the car twisted, distorting like melted wax. Everything felt unreal, as if the laws of reality were breaking down, and they were all trapped in the crumbling space between worlds. "Let go of me," Ryan shouted, using all his strength to free himself from the old man's grasp. With a violent yank, he pulled his arm free, his body slamming into the door. His hands flew to the handle, and he twisted it with desperate urgency, the cold metal of the door burning against his palm. The door didn't open. It was locked. It felt like the train had sealed them inside. The old man laughed, a low, rasping sound that echoed through the car. "It's too late, boy. It's already begun." Ryan spun around to face him. The train's movements were getting more erratic, more chaotic. The windows were now completely obscured by the fog. The darkness beyond the glass seemed to press against the walls of the train, like something was out there, something terrible, reaching for them. And inside, the air was thick, heavy, suffocating. "No! I need to get off!" Ryan screamed, his voice cracking. The old man just stared at him, unmoving, his smile widening. "You never got on, did you?" Ryan blinked, confusion flooding his mind. "What? What do you mean?" The old man's eyes gleamed with a sinister understanding, and for a moment, Ryan felt like he was seeing something that wasn't meant to be seen. The old man's form flickered, shifting like a shadow caught in the light. "This train doesn't take passengers. It collects them." His voice dropped lower, becoming a rasping whisper. "Once you board, there's no getting off. Blackwood chooses you." Ryan's heart stopped in his chest. Suddenly, everything went still. The train's rattling ceased. The lights flickered and went out completely, plunging them into darkness. For a moment, Ryan stood there in the cold, silent void, his breath shallow, his pulse hammering in his ears. His hands were trembling, and his mind felt foggy, disconnected. He felt dizzy, like he was losing his grip on reality. Then a soft, almost imperceptible sound reached his ears, a low, scratching, dragging noise coming from the rear of the train. The old man's eyes narrowed as he turned toward the sound, his head jerking unnaturally. He smiled again, but this time, it was a grin that made Ryan's blood run cold. "It's here," the old man whispered. "It's coming for you." The train jerked forward with a sudden, bone-jarring motion, making Ryan stumble. He grabbed onto a nearby pole to steady himself, his heart pounding in his chest. But as the train began to move again, it wasn't just the train that was moving. The entire car began to shake, as if something massive was pushing against it from the outside. The walls trembled, and a low, groaning sound filled the air, like the train was under pressure, like something was trying to break through. Ryan's eyes darted to the windows. The fog outside was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of blackness. It was as if the train was no longer traveling along tracks, but was floating through an empty void. The blackness stretched out forever, an abyss that threatened to swallow them whole. Then, through the darkness, a shape began to form. It was huge, looming, a monstrous silhouette, standing in the middle of the train car. Its presence seemed to fill the entire space. It had no face, no features, just an enormous, dark shape that blocked out all light. Ryan's breath caught in his throat as it shifted, slowly moving toward him. The old man's voice echoed in the silence. "It has come." Ryan tried to back away, his legs shaky and weak beneath him, but the creature in front of him seemed to move faster. It was getting closer, its form becoming more defined, and though it had no face, Ryan could feel its eyes on him. He could sense its hunger. Desperation surged through him. He had to escape. He had to. Without warning, the creature lunged forward, its massive limbs reaching for him. Ryan screamed, throwing himself to the side, but there was nowhere to go. The train car was closing in on him, trapping him. He could feel the coldness of the creature's touch on his skin, icy, burning at the same time, as if it was inside him. "Please!" Ryan gasped, his voice trembling with terror. "What do you want from me?" The creature's movements slowed, its shape twisting in the air, and a low growl reverberated through the train. Its massive form loomed over him, and then it spoke. "You're the last," it said, its voice deep and guttural, like 1,000 voices speaking at once. "The last to board. The last to be chosen." Ryan's blood ran cold as he realized the truth. He was no longer just a passenger. He was part of the train, part of whatever this place was. Blackwood wasn't a destination. It was a prison, and once you entered, you never left. Ryan's body went rigid as the creature's voice reverberated through the air, its words sinking deep into his soul like a dagger. The last. He felt the weight of the words press on him, suffocating him. His lungs tightened, his chest heavy, as if the very air had thickened with the creature's presence. He wanted to scream, but no sound came out. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. The creature moved closer, its form growing larger, more menacing. It was formless, a mass of shifting shadows that seemed to bend and pulse with a life of its own. The air around Ryan seemed to distort, like heat rising from pavement, but colder, colder than anything he had ever felt. The temperature dropped, freezing his breath in the air, turning it into a cloud of white mist. His mind raced. What was this thing? Was it the very embodiment of Blackwood, or something older, something darker? "You're not the first to board," the creature continued, its voice booming in his mind, vibrating through his bones. "But you will be the last." Ryan's heart thudded in his chest, panic surging through him like an electric shock. He had no idea what was happening, no idea what this thing wanted. All he knew was that it had come for him, and there was nowhere to run. The train had become a cage, and the creature was the warden. Desperately, Ryan's eyes darted around the car. The lights above flickered erratically, casting brief moments of clarity through the swirling darkness. But each time the lights blinked out, the creature seemed closer. It was not bound by space or time. It was everywhere at once, its form distorting in ways that made Ryan's stomach turn. It wasn't a thing you could understand. It wasn't bound by anything. The old man had been right. He never should have boarded. But it was too late for regrets. He had already stepped into the trap, and now there was no way out. "It's coming for you, boy." The old man's voice, a faint whisper, slithered into Ryan's mind. It was distant, but somehow still so close. "It already has." Ryan's hands trembled as he reached for his phone. It was the only thing he had left, a small sliver of normality in the overwhelming horror. He fumbled with it, trying to unlock it, to call someone, anyone, but the screen stayed blank. No signal, no connection to the outside world. The creature was closing in. "Why me?" Ryan whispered, his voice barely audible against the deafening silence that filled the train. The words were stupid, empty. He already knew the answer. "You were chosen," the creature said, its voice now a low, guttural rumble, as if the train itself were speaking. "Not all who board can survive. Not all who enter are meant to." Ryan staggered backward, his mind racing for a solution, for some way to escape, but there was nothing. Nothing at all. The walls of the train car seemed to pulse with a life of their own, and the air grew colder still, biting at his skin. He could feel the creature's presence, like it was watching, waiting. The old man had warned him, but it was too late to listen now. "The train will stop at Blackwood," the creature rumbled. "But you will never leave." A deafening shriek cut through the air, followed by the sound of metal grinding against metal. The train jolted violently, throwing Ryan to the ground. He slammed into the floor with a sickening thud, pain shooting through his ribs, but he didn't care. He had to get up. He had to move. He had to. Suddenly, everything stopped. The train, the creature, the entire world seemed to freeze. Ryan lay there on the floor, breathing hard, unable to move. He couldn't tell if it was a trick of his mind or if the world had truly come to a halt. His thoughts were fragmented, swirling as the fear, the terror, filled every corner of his being. The absence of sound was suffocating, more terrifying than anything he had felt before. Then the lights flickered again. Ryan blinked, his head pounding. The walls around him warped, twisting, bending in unnatural ways. It wasn't just the walls, it was the entire train. It was warping, shifting, like it was being pulled into another reality. His stomach turned violently, and a sudden, overwhelming feeling of vertigo hit him. He felt like he was being dragged through a thick, suffocating fog, his very sense of self being torn apart. His eyes locked onto the windows once more. Beyond the fog, there was nothing. There were no tracks, no signs of civilization. The train was no longer moving along any physical path. It was adrift in a void. And then, through the fog, something appeared. A flicker, just a shadow at first. But then clearer, more defined. A silhouette of a figure, standing still just outside the train. Ryan's heart stopped. He knew what it was, even before the shape solidified. It was the same as the old man. But it wasn't him. This figure was different, darker, more distorted. Its eyes burned with an unnatural light, and its face was a grotesque mask of anguish, stretched beyond human comprehension. Its body was twisted, writhing, as though it was made of smoke and shadows, an entity beyond the boundaries of reality. It was an embodiment of Blackwood. It was coming for him. Ryan couldn't breathe. He wanted to scream, but his voice was lost in the suffocating pressure of the atmosphere. The train car was spinning now, tilting, as if it was no longer bound to the world he knew. The figure outside moved closer, closer. "No one escapes Blackwood," the creature inside the train growled. Its voice now mingled with the voice of the figure outside, two voices becoming one, a chorus of death. "You are not the first, and you will not be the last. Blackwood takes what it desires, and it desires you." Ryan scrambled to his feet, his body trembling with the weight of terror. His legs felt like they were made of stone, but he forced them to move, forced himself toward the door. There had to be something, anything, to break the nightmare, to make it stop. But there was nothing. The world outside the window had changed. The fog had parted, revealing a dark, twisted version of Blackwood, a place that had never existed in reality. There were no streets, no homes, no roads. Only endless, crumbling ruins and towering shapes that defied physics, that tore through the sky like jagged claws. The world itself was a distorted, unrecognizable version of the place it had once been. The train was no longer on tracks. It was suspended, adrift in the vast, empty void. Ryan could feel his body shutting down, his mind splintering under the pressure. The creature inside, the thing that had been tormenting him, had only one purpose: to bring him to Blackwood. And it had succeeded. The lights went out. The complete darkness was suffocating, smothering Ryan in its cold, unyielding embrace. He could feel it pressing in on him from all sides, the very air thick with a sense of doom. The silence was deafening, more oppressive than any noise could have been. His heart pounded in his chest, and his breaths came in shallow gasps, the sound of his own panic deafening to him in the quiet. A faint sound reached his ears, slow, deliberate, like a dragging footstep across the floor. Ryan's blood ran cold. The thing was still in the car with him, that horrible creature, but he couldn't see it. He couldn't see anything. The air was so still, so unnatural. Then, through the darkness, a whispering voice broke the silence. It was soft, almost tender, but it held an unmistakable, terrifying edge. "You think you can escape, don't you?" The voice was low, malevolent, and familiar, echoing from every corner of the train car. It sounded like the old man's voice, but distorted, twisted by the dark force that now surrounded him. "There's nowhere to run, Ryan. Nowhere to hide." Ryan felt a cold hand on his shoulder, its touch like ice burning through his clothes. He spun around, but there was nothing, just the blackness. He reached out, his hand trembling as he searched for something, anything. But his fingers met only emptiness, the void stretching endlessly in all directions. "Please, no," Ryan whispered, his voice barely a breath. His mind was beginning to fracture. His thoughts were slipping away like sand through his fingers, lost in the overwhelming horror that seemed to consume everything around him. His grip on reality was slipping, and he could feel it. "There is no escape," the voice continued, now echoing all around him, wrapping around his mind like a noose. "Blackwood takes what it wants, and you are mine." The words seared into Ryan's consciousness. He wanted to scream, but his throat had closed up, his voice stolen away by the terror that clawed at his chest. He tried to move, to stumble toward the door, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. His body was numb, frozen in place by the overwhelming presence of the thing that haunted him. A low, grating laugh filled the air, cold and empty, like the sound of bones grinding together. The train's movements had stopped, but Ryan could feel the subtle vibrations of the car beneath his feet. It was no longer the train moving. It was something else, something far darker, far older. The train was a vessel, a prison, and the thing that rode with him was the warden. "Look around, Ryan." The voice sounded so close, so intimate, and yet it was still everywhere at once, inside his head. "Do you see it yet? The truth?" Ryan's eyes strained against the darkness, searching for something, anything that could explain this nightmare. But there was nothing. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, the kind that made it feel like he was drowning. He could feel the creature, that presence, getting closer, but it wasn't just physical proximity. It was something deeper. It was closing in on his mind, consuming his thoughts, twisting them, until he could no longer trust what was real and what wasn't. Then the lights flickered once more, dim and weak, barely enough to cut through the overwhelming blackness. Through the faint illumination, Ryan saw something move in the corner of his eye, a shape, a shadow, barely distinguishable from the surrounding dark. It shifted, then stopped, then moved again, slow and deliberate. Something was out there, something waiting. "You're part of it now," the voice said, softer this time, almost soothing. "You were always meant to be." Ryan's breath hitched. His mind screamed for him to wake up, to fight, to do anything, but his body wouldn't listen. His legs felt like lead, his muscles sluggish and unresponsive. He could barely lift his arms, let alone run. All he could do was stand there, surrounded by the creeping darkness, listening to the whispers that filled the space. The figure in the corner moved again, closer this time. The flickering lights caught it. A tall, gaunt figure, its form unnatural, too thin, as if it had been stretched out of shape. It was all wrong. Its arms hung too low, its legs too long, its body an unsettling collection of angles and broken lines. It was the old man, but not the same. This version of him was something worse, something twisted by whatever power had claimed this place. Ryan's heart thudded in his chest as the figure took another step forward, its movements jerky and inhuman. It reached up, its hands thin and skeletal, its fingers clawed, and it smiled. The smile was nothing human, just an empty, gaping hole where a face should have been. The creature's eyes burned with an unholy fire, the very embodiment of everything Ryan had feared in the last few moments of his life. "No," Ryan whispered, his voice cracking, his throat dry. "No, no, please." The creature tilted its head, as if considering him. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it raised a hand toward him, its fingers stretching, reaching, until they were just inches away from his face. The air grew thick with a suffocating cold. Ryan felt his body seize up, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps as if the very essence of life was being sucked from him. "You should have never boarded," the creature said, its voice dripping with malice. "But now you are mine. You will remain with me, as all the others have. Forever." Ryan wanted to run. He needed to run, but his body refused to obey. The creature's hand hovered in front of his face, cold as ice, and just before it touched him, he heard a sound. A sudden, loud thump. It echoed through the train like the sound of something heavy hitting the floor, and for a split second, the creature hesitated. Its eyes flickered, its movements freezing in place. That was enough. With a burst of adrenaline, Ryan forced his legs to move, stumbling backward, his body shaking with fear. He had no idea where he was going, no idea what direction was safe, but he didn't care. All he knew was that he had to get away. He had to survive. The train car seemed to stretch on endlessly as he ran, the walls warping and twisting around him, pulling him further into the void. The lights flickered again, but this time they didn't return. The darkness pressed in from all sides, and Ryan's panic surged as he fumbled for the door. His hands were trembling, slick with sweat, but finally he managed to pull it open. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He threw himself into the next car, the door slamming shut behind him. The car was dark, too, but there was a faint glow in the distance, a dim light that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. Ryan's eyes darted to it, and something in him told him he had to reach it. It was his only hope. The creature's laughter echoed from the darkness behind him, but it was distant now, fading. Ryan pushed himself forward, moving as fast as he could, feeling the weight of his fear, the weight of everything that had happened, bearing down on him. But as he reached the door to the next car, the dim light in the distance began to fade. It was fading just like the train, just like everything else. And in that moment, Ryan knew Blackwood had claimed him. Ryan's heart was pounding so violently that it felt like it might burst from his chest. His hands shook as they gripped the door handle, his fingers numb from the cold, the intense fear clawing at his insides. The dim light ahead, the only beacon of hope he had, was now nearly gone, swallowed by the encroaching blackness. Every instinct in his body screamed for him to run, to push forward, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. Each step was a struggle, his body exhausted, and yet he kept moving, desperate to escape whatever nightmare had trapped him here. His breath came in ragged gasps, his throat dry, and his mind was a blur of fragmented thoughts. Was he even moving in the right direction anymore? Could he trust his senses, or was this just another trick of the creature that haunted him? The train seemed to stretch on endlessly, the car doors opening into more shadowed corridors, the light in the distance flickering like a dying star. And yet, no matter how many cars he passed through, the layout was always the same, narrow, suffocating, twisted. The doors were just ahead, and Ryan pushed himself forward with a final burst of energy. His hand gripped the cold metal, and he wrenched the door open, stumbling into the next car. His eyes locked onto the faint glow at the far end. The light, so close now, was real, he told himself. It had to be. He ran, his footsteps echoing in the hollow space, growing louder with every passing second. The light pulsed, the only thing that felt tangible in this nightmare, drawing him in with its promise of escape. His breath was ragged, his pulse roaring in his ears, drowning out everything else. As he approached the light, it became clearer. It was a small, flickering lantern, placed on a wooden crate at the far end of the car. But there was something unsettling about it, something off. It wasn't just any lantern. It was the same one that had hung in the corner of the waiting room, the one that had first caught his eye when he entered the station. "No," Ryan whispered, his voice trembling as the realization hit him. He was no closer to escaping than before. The light, the lantern, it was all part of the trap. It wasn't an escape. It was a signal, a beacon for the thing that had taken hold of him. The lantern flickered one last time, and then, with a sudden burst of cold air, it extinguished. A deafening silence followed. Ryan froze. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. His body locked in place, paralyzed by the terror that surged through him. In the absolute quiet, the world around him felt wrong, distorted. He could feel it in his bones, the train, the dark forces that had been pulling him deeper into Blackwood. They were closing in. And then, from the shadows, the creature emerged. It was tall, too tall, its body elongated, contorting unnaturally as it slithered forward. Its eyes glowed with a sickly green light, its mouth wide, impossibly so, stretching from ear to ear, a jagged, gaping maw of darkness. The old man's face, no, not the old man, was now barely recognizable, twisted, decayed, a mask of horror and suffering. It was wearing his form, but it was something more, something worse. Ryan staggered back, his mind struggling to comprehend the horror in front of him. This wasn't just some creature. It was a force, a malevolent presence that existed beyond his understanding. It had taken everything, his hope, his sanity, and now it would take his life. "You're not leaving," the creature hissed, its voice a guttural growl, a sound that vibrated in the air and twisted Ryan's very core. "You are here now, Ryan. You belong to Blackwood." Ryan's chest tightened, his breath coming faster as the walls of the train car seemed to close in around him, pressing against his skin, suffocating him. The creature moved closer, its eyes locked onto his, a predatory hunger in its gaze. It was coming for him, and he couldn't escape. But then something happened. The train jolted violently, shaking Ryan off balance, throwing him to the floor. His head slammed against the hard metal, the impact dizzying him. But his vision remained clear enough to see the creature hesitate for a brief moment. It was confused, distracted. The creature's form flickered, like a shadow shifting in the light, and for just a second, Ryan could see something in its depths, something other than darkness. There was a spark, a flicker of light, and then the creature surged forward, faster than before. "It's too late," the creature growled, its voice now filled with rage. "You are mine. There is no escaping this." Ryan pushed himself up, blood dripping from his forehead, pain shooting through his limbs. The walls, the very train itself, seemed to warp and shift around him, the floor trembling underfoot. The air had become thick, like he was submerged in water, but colder, freezing. His breath came in foggy bursts, and his legs felt unsteady, as if the ground beneath him were no longer solid. The train had become a vessel of chaos, a twisting nightmare. His eyes darted around, his mind desperately searching for any way out, but all he could see were the shifting shadows and the flickering lights. The creature was closer now, its breath hot and foul, its presence suffocating, and the light was gone, extinguished, just like the last flicker of hope Ryan had clung to. And then suddenly the sound returned. A distant thumping, slow, steady like a heartbeat. It echoed in the far reaches of the train, getting louder with each passing second. It wasn't just a thumping, it was a drumbeat, deep, rhythmic, pounding with the force of something ancient, something that had been waiting. The train lurched forward with a violent jerk, and Ryan staggered, grabbing the nearest seat to steady himself. The world outside the window was gone. Blackness had swallowed everything. The pounding grew louder. Ryan's body shook uncontrollably as the realization hit him. The train was the last part of the puzzle. It was never meant to leave. It wasn't just a mode of transportation. It was a vessel, a prison, designed to carry him straight into the heart of Blackwood. The train was alive, bound by forces that reached far beyond human comprehension. He turned toward the door again, his legs unsteady, but his resolve hardening. There was nowhere else to go. The creature was only a step behind, and Blackwood was pulling him deeper into its grasp. But Ryan wasn't ready to give in, not yet. Not without a fight. With a final, desperate push, Ryan moved toward the door. The train screeched as it moved faster, the metallic groans rising to a deafening roar. The lights above flickered once more, the train itself now pulsing with a dark, terrible energy, a deep hum that vibrated through his bones. And as the train surged forward, Ryan's mind screamed one last time for escape. But there was no escaping Blackwood, no escaping the nightmare that had claimed him. The doors opened to the unknown. Ryan's hand trembled as he gripped the door handle, his pulse roaring in his ears. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to find another way, but his legs refused to stop. The very air felt thick with menace, oppressive and suffocating, as if the train itself had become a living thing, alive with hunger, seeking its next victim. He yanked open the door, stumbling into the next car. The interior was no different, dark, endless, and filled with the oppressive silence of the unknown. His eyes scanned the dim, flickering light, looking for some sign of escape, but it was all the same. The walls, the seats, the cold metal beneath his feet, it was all an unchanging blur. Behind him, the creature's presence loomed like a shadow, a constant weight pressing against him, closer with every second. He could feel its eyes on his back, its breath hot and fetid, like decay itself. It was patient. It didn't need to rush. It knew, as Ryan did now, that there was nowhere else to go. The train was a prison, and they were trapped within it. Ryan stumbled forward, his mind reeling. He needed to find the exit. He needed to get out before the thing caught him. But the longer he moved through the train, the less certain he became of his path. The train didn't make sense. The layout was constantly changing, twisting in on itself, as if it was bending to some otherworldly force. The car doors seemed to lead to the same places, over and over again. He was going in circles. His breath came in shallow gasps. Sweat clung to his skin. His legs felt like jelly, and his chest tightened with every step. But the creature was always there, waiting. It was a predator toying with him, giving him the illusion of choice. There was no escaping. It was only a matter of time. Then, just as his hope was beginning to crack, the sound came again. The thumping, the rhythm that echoed through the train. It was louder now, like the beating of a heart, the very pulse of the train. It was coming from ahead, not from the creature behind. It sounded like a signal, a drumbeat, calling him forward. Despite the terror gnawing at his soul, something inside him urged him to follow the sound. What else could he do? Everything else had led to nothing. Desperation took hold of him, pushing him forward, despite the pounding dread in his chest. He moved toward the source of the noise, his legs carrying him with a frantic determination. As he reached the end of the next car, the air grew colder. The train screeched as it barreled through the endless blackness, but the sound of the heartbeat, the thumping, was louder now. It was so close, he could almost feel it vibrating in his bones. His heart raced in time with the beat, and a cold sweat trickled down his spine. He reached for the door, trembling, barely able to keep himself standing. The metal was freezing beneath his touch, the chill seeping through his fingertips. When he opened the door, it led him to a small, dimly lit compartment. It was different from the others. The air here was thick with an odd, acrid scent, and there was a strange stillness, as though the world beyond had ceased to exist. The lights in the room flickered weakly, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. Ryan stepped inside cautiously, his breath fogging in the cold air. The drumbeat was louder now, so loud it almost felt like the walls were shaking with it. The room was narrow, lined with old, faded furniture, chairs, a table, a few discarded newspapers. The walls were covered in strange, shifting patterns, twisting and writhing as if they were alive. The air seemed to shimmer with a disturbing energy. And then he saw it. At the far end of the room, there was a window. It was covered with grime, and Ryan could barely make out anything through the thick glass, but he felt a strange pull toward it. Something was drawing him in, urging him to look, to see what lay beyond. He approached slowly, his footsteps echoing in the silence. As he drew closer, the glass became clearer, revealing the world outside the window. It was an endless, desolate landscape, dark and barren, stretching out in every direction. The ground was cracked and dry, like a wasteland untouched by time. And in the distance, a towering figure loomed, Blackwood itself, standing like an ancient sentinel. Ryan's blood ran cold. He recognized the silhouette. It was the town, the place he had been heading toward, but it was wrong. It was not the town he remembered. It was dark, twisted, its buildings rotting away, consumed by a thick fog that hung like a shroud. And all around it, there were hundreds, no thousands, of faces, their eyes staring at him from the darkness. Silent, unmoving, their expressions frozen in eternal fear. The thumping grew louder, now almost deafening, pounding through Ryan's skull. The air vibrated with the intensity of it. He could feel it deep in his chest, in his very bones. The window began to shake, the glass rattling violently, as if it were about to shatter. Ryan stumbled back, his breath coming in short gasps. He could feel something closing in on him, a presence creeping up behind him. He spun around, but there was nothing, only the oppressive darkness of the train car, and the growing sense that whatever force had been guiding him was now pulling him toward the inevitable. The creature appeared, standing in the doorway. Its shadow stretched across the room, dark and long, like a twisting serpent. Its eyes gleamed with a terrible hunger, and its lips twisted into a grotesque smile. It was closer now, too close, and Ryan could hear the soft rustling of its clothes, the rasp of its breath, as it stepped toward him. "You see it now," the creature hissed, its voice a guttural growl. "The truth. Blackwood is not just a place. It is a prison, a land that devours the living. And once you are here, there is no leaving. Not for you, not for anyone." Ryan's body froze. The words hit him like a blow to the chest. He had been chosen, just as the others had been before him. The train, the town, the creature. Everything had been a trap, an inescapable cycle of horror. And now, it was his turn to join the endless ranks of the lost. "You will become one of us," the creature whispered, its breath cold against Ryan's face. "Forever." Ryan took a step back, but there was nowhere left to retreat. The walls of the train car were closing in, pressing in on him, suffocating him. He could hear the voices in his head, the others trapped in Blackwood, their whispers now merging with the creature's words. There is no escape. There is no hope. The lights flickered one last time before going out entirely, plunging the train into absolute darkness. And in that moment, the air went still, utterly still. The darkness was suffocating, like the very air had thickened into a viscous, cold fog that wrapped around Ryan's body, making it hard to move, hard to breathe. His chest was tight, his heart pounding like a drum in the hollow silence. The creature's presence loomed in the pitch-black void, its eyes the only things visible, glowing faintly like a pair of burning embers in the dark. Ryan could feel the weight of its gaze on him, its predatory hunger suffocating the space between them. The air was thick with malevolent energy, the train vibrating underfoot with a low hum that seemed to reverberate through his bones. The creature's voice, a soft, insidious whisper, came from all around him. "You think you can escape," it hissed, its voice slithering through the darkness. "But you belong to Blackwood now. You've already crossed the threshold. There's no way out." Ryan's breath hitched as a cold sweat slicked his skin. His mind reeled, scrambling for any shred of logic, any way to make sense of the madness that surrounded him. The train, the town, the creature. Had he been dreaming? Was this some twisted nightmare he couldn't wake from? A loud, sudden bang echoed in the distance, and Ryan snapped his head toward the sound, his pulse skipping a beat. It was followed by a chorus of distant whispers, the voices of the lost, of those who had been claimed by Blackwood before him. It was then that Ryan realized with horror that the train was no longer moving. They were not going anywhere. The train was a prison, not a vessel. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This was it. This was the end. His hands trembled as he tried to steady himself, his legs weak beneath him. His breath caught in his throat, but no sound came out. His mind was overwhelmed, and the weight of the reality he was facing felt crushing. There was no escape. The silence stretched on, the air growing colder still, until a faint, eerie glow appeared at the far end of the car. At first, it was small, barely noticeable, like a flicker of light at the edge of a storm. But it grew quickly, pulsing like the beat of a heart, brighter and brighter, until it filled the entire car. And in its glow, the walls of the train car seemed to shift. The edges of the room warped and bent like soft clay under the pressure of something unseen. Ryan's breath came out in short, ragged gasps as the light grew unbearable, so intense that it seemed to tear through the very fabric of reality. The air was thick with it, and the oppressive darkness that had once consumed him was now replaced with a blinding, searing light. It felt like an invasion, a force far beyond his comprehension, far beyond anything he could fight. The creature stood still in the center of the light, its features blurred and distorted, its once sharp outline now a haze of shifting shadows. Its eyes burned brighter, glowing like twin suns, and its jagged grin twisted into something even more grotesque. "You will never leave," it said, the voice now a low growl that seemed to vibrate through Ryan's entire body. "You were chosen for this. Blackwood claims all." Ryan staggered back, his mind screaming for him to run, to hide, to do anything to escape the suffocating grip of the creature's presence. But there was nowhere to go, no corner to hide in, no door to open. He was trapped, bound by the overwhelming force of Blackwood's curse. The light flared even brighter, and for a moment, Ryan thought he could hear something, someone calling his name. It was distant, faint, but it sounded familiar, like the voice of someone he had known long ago. It was soft, gentle, and carried a note of sorrow. For just a brief moment, it pulled at something deep within him, something human. But the moment passed in the blink of an eye. The creature's smile stretched even wider, its mouth opening impossibly wide, and it lunged forward, its skeletal fingers reaching for Ryan. The air felt thick with the weight of its motion, and Ryan could feel the cold chill of death itself reaching out for him. His body froze, unable to react, as the creature's fingers brushed against his skin, sending a shock of icy terror through his entire being. He tried to scream, but the sound caught in his throat, strangled by the creature's grip. The world around him spun, the light and dark blending into a swirling chaos. His vision blurred, his senses overloaded, until the ground beneath him seemed to dissolve. And then there was nothing. No light, no sound, no train, no creature, only darkness. Ryan floated in it, suspended in some void, alone and untethered, his thoughts swirling like the blackness around him. Time seemed to stretch into infinity, the minutes, the hours, the years, none of them mattered anymore. There was no beginning and no end, no escape. The darkness pulsed, and then slowly something began to form. At first, it was a shape, barely noticeable, like a smudge on the edge of his vision. It grew larger, clearer, until it became undeniable. It was the shape of a door, the door he had passed through countless times on the train, the one that led into the unknown. But this time it was different. This time, there was no light beyond it, only darkness. A darkness that reached out from the other side, clawing at the door, trying to pull it open. Ryan's heart hammered in his chest as he instinctively reached for the door. His fingers brushed against the cold metal, and he could feel the weight of it. The creature was gone, but the dread, the terror, lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating. He pushed against the door with all his remaining strength, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. The lock, cold and unyielding, held firm. Behind him, the darkness pulsed once again, and in the distance, Ryan could hear the thumping, the heartbeat of Blackwood, the pulse of the land that claimed him. The train had stopped. He had stopped. But the journey wasn't over. The creature was gone, but something much worse awaited him on the other side of that door. Ryan's heart raced as he pressed his palms against the cold metal of the door, his mind desperate for some kind of escape. He could feel the pull of Blackwood, that dark and suffocating force, growing stronger with each passing second. The thumping sound, louder now, more frantic, continued to reverberate through the air, an ominous reminder that there was no end to this nightmare. He tugged at the door again, but it refused to move. The lock, heavy and stubborn, seemed to mock him with its resistance. His breath came in sharp gasps, the cold sweat soaking through his clothes. There had to be another way. He had to find a way out. The thought of staying here, trapped in the never-ending dark, made his stomach churn with dread. For a moment, the sound of the thumping ceased, and the eerie silence was almost worse. It was as though the world had stopped entirely, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, from the corners of the room, came the whispers. Faint at first, just a murmur at the edge of his hearing, but soon growing louder, more insistent. "You will never leave. You will never escape," they whispered, their voices low and slithering, like the sound of something crawling just beneath the surface of his mind. The words felt like a poison, seeping into his thoughts, filling him with despair. Ryan shook his head, trying to block them out. He refused to listen. He couldn't. He couldn't let them win. He had to fight. Suddenly, the door in front of him groaned, the metal creaking as if something was stirring on the other side. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. The door, it was moving. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the lock began to shift. A faint, scraping sound echoed through the dark room, sending a shiver down his spine. A figure stepped into the faint light, its shadow long and distorted as it loomed over him. Ryan recoiled instinctively, his back pressing against the cold, unyielding door. The figure was tall, its features indistinct in the darkness, but its eyes glowed, a sickly greenish hue, like the glow of decay. The thing that had been following him, the creature, was now standing in front of him. But it wasn't the same. It was different. The face was twisted, an unholy mask of sorrow and rage. Its skin, once pale and smooth, was now mottled, decayed in places like rotting flesh. The air around it was thick with the stench of death, a rancid odor that made Ryan gag. "You're not alive anymore," the creature hissed, its voice garbled and low, as if speaking from deep within the earth. "You've crossed the threshold. You've entered Blackwood's grasp, and there is no going back." Ryan's heart pounded in his chest. He took a step back, his body shaking with fear. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't. He had to find a way out. But the creature's grin stretched wider, its mouth opening unnaturally wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. It moved closer, its long, bony fingers reaching for him. Ryan screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the crushing silence. He was trapped. He was going to die here, in this godforsaken place. But then, something unexpected happened. A voice, not the creature's but another, soft, desperate, pleading, cut through the darkness. "Ryan," the voice trembled, barely a whisper, but it was unmistakable. "Ryan, help me." Ryan's eyes snapped wide open. The voice, it was familiar. It was the same voice he had heard earlier, the voice that had called his name in the light of Blackwood. It was pleading, but not for itself. It was begging for his help. Ryan's mind spun in confusion, but he couldn't ignore it. He turned toward the sound of the voice, his gaze scanning the shadows, desperate to find its source. He had to help. Whatever it was, whoever it was, needed him. The creature, sensing his distraction, let out a guttural snarl and lunged forward, its claws extending like talons. Ryan barely dodged in time, stumbling backward into the darkness. "Help me, Ryan," the voice came again, stronger now, filled with urgency. "Please, it's not too late." Ryan didn't hesitate this time. He followed the voice, ignoring the creature's snarls behind him. The darkness seemed to part before him, the shadows moving aside as he stumbled through them, his heart racing with the need to find the source of that voice. As he rounded the corner of the train car, he saw it, her, a figure cloaked in tattered rags, standing at the far end of the car. Her face was pale, gaunt, her eyes wide and glassy with fear. She was reaching out toward him, her hand trembling. "Please, I can't get out," she whispered, her voice weak. "Help me. Ryan, you're the only one who can help me." Ryan's mind reeled. Who is she? He didn't know her. He had never seen her before. But there was something in her eyes, something in her voice, that told him she was not like the others. She wasn't a part of the nightmare. She was a victim, just like him. But as he took a step forward, the air around him grew colder. The temperature dropped sharply, sending a wave of frost through the room. The lights flickered, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The shadows around him stretched, distorting into long, twisted shapes, their edges fraying like torn paper. Ryan stopped dead in his tracks. Something was wrong. Suddenly, the woman's hand shot up, pointing directly at him. "No, Ryan, don't come any closer." Before Ryan could react, a cold gust of wind slammed into him, pushing him back. The woman's face twisted in agony, her mouth opening wide in a silent scream. Her form began to flicker and distort, her body twitching as if something was forcing itself out of her. In an instant, the illusion shattered. The woman's face contorted into something monstrous, her features melting away to reveal a hollow, gaping void where her eyes should have been. The rest of her body twisted in on itself, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. Ryan staggered back in horror, his chest tightening with panic. He had made a terrible mistake. The voice wasn't begging for his help, it had been luring him. "You can't save anyone here," the voice, now deep and echoing, rumbled from the creature's mouth. "We are all trapped here. Forever." Ryan's blood ran cold as the last shred of hope drained from him. He was alone, completely and utterly alone. And then, the train screeched to a halt. The train came to a sudden, jarring halt, its screeching brakes cutting through the air like the shrill cry of a dying animal. Ryan's entire body lurched forward, his stomach dropping as the motion threw him off balance. He had no time to steady himself before he collided with the cold metal floor. The lights flickered violently, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to creep toward him, as if the very darkness itself was alive and hungry. He pushed himself up with shaky hands, his heart racing in his chest. The air had grown heavier, thick with something that wasn't quite fear, but a deep, gnawing despair. The oppressive silence that followed the train's stop was suffocating, like the world was holding its breath. The voice, no, the creature, was gone, but the sense of dread lingered. Ryan looked around, his eyes scanning the dimly lit train car, his mind screaming for some kind of explanation, some clue to what was happening. The train itself felt different now, more alive somehow. The walls of the car seemed to pulse gently, as if breathing. The floor beneath him creaked with an unsettling groan, as though the train was shifting, stretching, bending. In the distance, just beyond the confines of the train, he thought he saw a shadow flicker. It moved unnaturally, like a figure caught between realms, but when he blinked, it was gone. The wind outside had picked up, howling against the windows with an eerie, mournful sound. But there were no lights outside, no stations, no signs of civilization, just the endless, unyielding dark. Ryan's pulse quickened again, a knot forming in his stomach. Where was the train? Where were they? The idea of getting off, of stepping into whatever lay beyond the train, was unthinkable. But the longer he stayed on board, the more he felt himself suffocating, trapped in this nightmarish limbo. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence, a creak, followed by the unmistakable clack of footsteps. Ryan's head snapped toward the sound, his breath catching in his throat. He had been alone, or so he thought, but now there was someone else. He wasn't sure if he should be relieved or terrified. The footsteps grew louder, approaching from behind him, and Ryan's instincts screamed at him to move, to hide, to run. But his feet felt like they were glued to the floor. His body refused to cooperate, frozen in place as the sound drew nearer. The footsteps stopped. "You don't belong here," a voice, quiet, yet dripping with venom, whispered in his ear. Ryan spun around, his eyes widening in horror. The figure that stood before him was a man. A twisted reflection of humanity. It was tall and thin, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones, its eyes dark and empty. Its lips curled into a grotesque smile, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too jagged. It tilted its head, as if studying Ryan with twisted curiosity. "You think you can escape?" the creature mocked, its voice a low rasp. "You think you can wake from this? You're dead, boy. All of you are." Ryan's breath hitched as a cold shiver ran down his spine. He took an instinctive step back, his mind scrambling for an answer, for anything that could explain the horror he was now facing. But there was nothing, no rational explanation, no comforting thought to hold on to. Just the overwhelming presence of something ancient and evil, something that had existed far longer than he ever could have imagined. I don't understand," Ryan said, his voice shaking. "What is this place? Where am I?" The creature's smile widened, its eyes glowing with a sickly, unnatural light. "You're on the last train, boy. The last train to Blackwood." Blackwood. The name reverberated in his mind like a distant echo. He had heard it before, somewhere in the deep recesses of his memory, but it felt as though it was fading, slipping away just out of reach. It was as if the very mention of Blackwood caused his memories to blur, to warp. The creature stepped closer, its breath rancid and cold against Ryan's face. "You're not meant to leave," it hissed, its voice dripping with malice. "You were chosen, and now you're mine. You belong to Blackwood." Ryan stumbled backward, his heart thundering in his chest. No, I don't belong here. I need to get off this train. I need to leave." His voice was frantic, desperate. The words barely made sense to him, but the panic was too overwhelming to ignore. The creature let out a low laugh, a sound that seemed to crawl beneath Ryan's skin, scratching at his very soul. "You can't leave, boy. The train doesn't stop. It never stops. Not until Blackwood claims you. And once it does, you're just another lost soul on the tracks." Ryan's mind raced, his thoughts a tangled mess. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. He had to be dreaming. He had to be. But the pain in his chest, the coldness of the air, the dread that seemed to rise from every shadow, it all felt far too real to deny. "Help me," a voice whispered faintly in the distance. It was familiar, weak, like it was coming from far away. Ryan's head snapped up, his eyes searching the shadows, desperate for any sign of movement. The voice sounded like someone was calling him. Someone in pain, someone trapped, just like him. "Please," the voice continued, more insistent now. "Help me, you have to stop them." Without thinking, Ryan bolted toward the source of the voice, ignoring the creature's twisted laughter behind him. The footsteps followed, the sound of pursuit growing louder and louder, but Ryan refused to look back. He couldn't let that thing catch him. As he ran through the train car, the darkness seemed to close in around him. The walls stretched, elongating as if the very structure of the train was warping to keep him from escaping. The air grew colder, thicker with the presence of something unseen. His breath formed clouds of mist in front of him, his legs aching with every step, but he didn't dare stop. He couldn't. The train had stopped. The world had stopped. And now it was all about to change. Ryan's legs burned as he sprinted down the narrow corridor of the train, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The air around him felt thick, like he was running through molasses, but he kept going, driven by the desperate need to escape whatever nightmare this place had become. The voice, the one calling for help, seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the walls, bouncing off the metal surfaces like some kind of twisted melody. "Please help me, you have to stop them." The words rang in his ears, growing louder with each passing second. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the voice wasn't just asking for help, it was warning him, telling him that something was coming, something worse than the creature, something far darker. The train lurched forward again, but this time, it wasn't the jarring stop-and-start motion he had become accustomed to. This time, the movement was smoother, more deliberate. The carriages creaked and groaned as the train picked up speed, its wheels screeching against the track in a way that made Ryan's skin crawl. Ahead of him, the hallway seemed to stretch on longer than it should have. The walls twisted, their shapes shifting, warping into grotesque forms. The flickering lights above him sparked erratically, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance, mocking his every step. He had lost track of time. He didn't know how long he had been running, or if there was even an end to the train. Was this endless corridor all that existed now? Was there any way out? Ryan slowed, his legs trembling from exhaustion, his mind barely able to focus on anything other than the relentless rhythm of his heartbeat. He had to keep going. He had to find the source of the voice. He had to get off this train. "Please, Ryan," the voice came again, but this time it was different. It wasn't a cry for help anymore. It was something else, something darker. A chill ran down Ryan's spine, and he paused, his breath catching in his throat. It was as if the air around him had suddenly thickened, become heavier. The voice was now speaking in a language he didn't understand. The words twisted and spiraled in a way that sent a shiver of dread crawling up his neck. He turned, instinctively looking over his shoulder, but there was nothing there. Just the dark, empty hallway behind him. He faced forward again, but this time, something was different. At the far end of the corridor, a door had appeared. It wasn't there before. There had been no sign of it, but now it stood there, just out of reach. A simple door, ordinary, but something about it called to him. Ryan's heart skipped a beat. Was this the way out? He couldn't tell, but something in the back of his mind screamed at him to go through it. He moved toward it, his legs like lead with every step. The closer he got, the more the air seemed to vibrate with a strange energy, a hum deep beneath the floorboards. His fingers trembled as he reached for the handle. For a split second, he hesitated, his mind racing with 100 questions, 1,000 fears. But his desperation pushed him forward. He couldn't let himself be consumed by whatever darkness had taken hold of the train. The handle turned easily in his grip, the door creaking open with a reluctant groan. Ryan stepped inside, his breath catching in his throat as the world beyond the door revealed itself. What lay before him wasn't just another train car. It was an entirely different place. A different world. The room he entered was dimly lit, the walls covered in moss and strange, twisting vines that seemed to grow directly from the wood. The air was thick, cloying, as if he had stepped into a tomb. The floor was covered in a layer of thick, damp leaves, and the ground beneath his feet gave a soft, spongy feeling with every step. He looked around, his mind struggling to make sense of it. This wasn't a train at all. The door had led him into a forest. A dark, eerie forest. "Ryan," the voice whispered again, but this time it came from the very trees, their branches bending and twisting as if they were alive. It was still here. Whatever it was, the thing that had been following him since the beginning, the creature, the darkness. It was alive, feeding on his fear, on his confusion. He turned sharply, his eyes darting around the shadowed space. The train was gone. The metal walls, the tracks, they had all disappeared, replaced by an ancient forest of towering, gnarled trees. The branches twisted and clawed at the air, their fingers reaching for him, as if they too were trying to pull him in. His breath came faster now, panic surging in his chest. He had no idea where he was. He didn't know how he got here, and there was no sign of the train. The path in front of him seemed to fork in multiple directions, each trail darker and more foreboding than the last. The whispers were growing louder, a chorus of voices now, calling his name, pulling him deeper into the forest. "Please, Ryan," one voice begged, low and weak. Another voice, darker, colder, whispered, "You should have never stepped off the train." Ryan's chest tightened with fear, and for a brief moment, he thought he heard something moving behind him. He spun around, but all that greeted him was the stillness of the forest. The trees seemed to watch him, their twisted branches swaying in the wind that had picked up, sending the leaves rustling through the air like whispers. "Where am I?" he asked aloud, his voice breaking through the silence. "What is this place?" The only answer was a low, guttural chuckle, a sound that came from the shadows around him. He wasn't alone. He knew that now. He could feel it, the presence, lurking just beyond the edge of his vision. He was being watched, hunted. The wind howled again, louder this time, and the branches above him creaked and groaned, as if the forest itself was waking up. Something was out there, something ancient, something that knew him. Ryan swallowed hard, his mind spinning with questions, but the overwhelming sense of dread told him there were no answers to find here. Only death. He didn't want to stay. He didn't want to find out what lived in these woods. But no matter which way he turned, the path seemed to stretch on endlessly, the trees closing in behind him like the jaws of a predator. There was no escaping it, no escaping Blackwood. And then, from the darkness ahead, a figure stepped forward. The figure emerged from the shadows, tall and gaunt, its face obscured by a hooded cloak. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if it had all the time in the world to watch Ryan's every movement. The air around it seemed to ripple, distorting the space in a way that made Ryan's skin crawl. He could feel it before he even saw it, the oppressive weight of something ancient, something that should not exist, pressing down on him. The figure stopped just a few feet away, its presence so cold that it seemed to drain the warmth from the air around them. Ryan's heart skipped a beat, his breath freezing in his chest. He didn't know who or what this being was, but its very presence made him feel smaller, insignificant, like a speck of dust about to be swept away by an unstoppable force. For a moment, the figure stood still, watching him with unseen eyes, before it tilted its head, a soft rustling sound coming from beneath its hood. "You should not have come here," it said, its voice low and rasping, as if it had been dragged from the depths of some forgotten tomb. Ryan's throat went dry. He couldn't move. His body felt paralyzed by the weight of the creature's gaze. His mind screamed at him to run, to get as far away as possible, but his feet remained rooted to the ground. "This is not your place," the figure continued, its voice sending a shiver through his spine. "You were never meant to find Blackwood. You were never meant to board the last train." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with meaning. Ryan tried to force himself to speak, but the words caught in his throat. What did it mean? What was Blackwood? The figure took a slow step forward, its cloak swirling around it like smoke, and Ryan flinched instinctively, taking a half step back. It seemed to notice his fear, and though its face remained hidden, it tilted its head once more in that strange, unsettling way. "I know what you are thinking," the figure whispered. "You think you're dreaming, don't you? You think you've simply lost your way, that there's some logical explanation for all of this. But you're wrong. You are here, Ryan, and there is no waking up from this." The world seemed to tilt around him. His breath hitched as the weight of the figure's words settled in. There is no waking up. That thought burrowed into his mind like a parasite, gnawing at his sanity. Ryan took a shaky breath, his voice trembling as he finally found the strength to speak. What is Blackwood?" His words felt weak, fragile, as if they might shatter the moment they left his mouth. The figure's lips twisted into something that might have been a smile, though it was impossible to tell through the darkness of the hood. "Blackwood is the end, Ryan. The last stop. The place where those who are lost find their final resting place. A place where time doesn't exist, where death is a distant memory, and where souls are forgotten. Ryan's chest tightened. He didn't understand. This was impossible. None of this made sense. "I'm not dead," he whispered, almost pleading. "I can't be." The figure tilted its head once again, this time in something resembling amusement. "No, you are not dead. Not yet." The words lingered in the air, heavy with implication. "But you will be. You and all the others who board the last train. You're all part of the cycle now, Ryan. You are part of Blackwood." Before Ryan could respond, the figure reached up, pulling back its hood. The face beneath was wrong, twisted, as if it had been stretched and contorted beyond recognition. Hollow, sunken eyes stared back at him, glowing with an otherworldly light. Its skin was as pale as death itself, mottled with patches of decay. Its mouth opened wide, too wide, revealing rows of sharp teeth, jagged and uneven, like the jaws of some monstrous creature. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to scream, to run, but his legs refused to move. He was frozen in place, his body betraying him in the face of this horror. "Do you understand now?" the creature rasped, its voice a chilling echo that seemed to reverberate in Ryan's very bones. "You are in Blackwood now. You will never leave, and neither will they." Suddenly, the ground beneath Ryan's feet began to shake. The trees around him groaned, their branches twisting and reaching for him, as if they were alive and hungry. The very air seemed to warp, the world around him bending and distorting like a nightmare he couldn't escape. The figure extended a bony hand toward Ryan, its fingers long and skeletal, each one ending in a claw-like talon. "Come," it said softly. "It is time." A horrible, suffocating weight pressed down on Ryan, and for the first time he felt it, the crushing reality of what was happening, the truth that had been buried beneath layers of confusion and fear. He was trapped. There was no escape. He was part of Blackwood now, and there was no going back. Before Ryan could react, the figure's hand closed around his wrist, its grip cold and tight. The world around him spun, and in that moment, he knew he was being pulled deeper into whatever hell this place was. The darkness seemed to swallow him whole. Ryan's body jerked as the figure's grip tightened around his wrist, the coldness of its touch seeping through his skin and into his very bones. The world around him was slipping, unraveling. The eerie forest, the gnarled trees, the twisted shadows, all of it was dissolving, replaced by an overwhelming darkness. He could feel himself being dragged, unable to fight back, as if the very air itself was swallowing him whole. He gasped for breath, but the air felt thick, suffocating. The figure's grip pulled him forward, its movements smooth and deliberate, as if it had done this 1,000 times before. Ryan's vision blurred, the edges of his perception darkening, and for a moment, he wondered if he was losing his mind. Was this real? Was any of this real? Then, just as quickly as it had started, the motion stopped. He found himself standing in a vast, open space, a place so desolate and barren that it felt like the last remnants of existence. There were no trees here, no train, no tracks. Just an endless expanse of nothing. A void. The figure released his wrist, its hand withdrawing with a sound like dry leaves scraping across the ground. Ryan staggered, his legs unsteady beneath him, and looked around in a panic. He couldn't see anything, nothing but blackness stretching out in every direction. There was no sky, no ground, no stars. Only darkness. "Welcome to Blackwood," the figure's voice echoed, resonating through the void. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The place where the lost souls come to rest. The place where time itself is forgotten. Ryan swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. The weight of the figure's words hung heavy in the air, like the oppressive pressure of the ocean's depths. His throat tightened as the truth sank in. He wasn't just in a nightmare. This place was real. This place was the end of the line. "What is this place?" he managed to croak, his voice barely a whisper against the suffocating silence. The figure's laughter was a low, haunting sound that seemed to vibrate the very air. Blackwood is the destination, Ryan. The final stop. Everyone who boards the last train ends up here, in this place between places. You're no different from the others. The words cut into him like a blade. He wasn't special. He wasn't unique. He was just another soul trapped in Blackwood. Another lost passenger who had boarded the train without realizing what it truly was. Ryan's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white with tension. "No," he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls of the void. "I don't belong here. I'm not dead. I'm not like them." The figure tilted its head, its hooded face unreadable in the eternal darkness. It was quiet for a moment, as if considering his words before it spoke again. "You misunderstand, Ryan." The voice was no longer harsh, but strangely patient, as if explaining something to a child. "You are not dead yet, but you will be, and once you are, you will join the others. You will be lost, like all the souls who passed through here before you, trapped in this endless void with no escape." Ryan staggered back, his mind reeling. He couldn't accept it. He wouldn't accept it. This couldn't be real. There had to be another way out. There had to be a chance to return to the world he knew. But as he looked around at the endless void, the feeling of hopelessness began to creep in, cold and insidious, like a shadow settling over his heart. Suddenly, the ground beneath him trembled, sending a shockwave through the void. Ryan stumbled, almost falling to his knees, as the figure before him stood still, unfazed by the disturbance. The air shifted, swirling with a strange energy, and the darkness around him seemed to ripple, like a fabric being pulled in all directions. And then the void began to change. It started slowly at first, like a flicker in the distance, a blur of movement in the darkness. But soon, shapes began to materialize out of the blackness. Faint, indistinct forms, like ghosts drifting in and out of focus. They moved in the periphery of Ryan's vision, never fully coming into view. But the sensation of being watched grew stronger. He could feel the eyes of countless souls on him, their presence suffocating, oppressive. One of the shapes began to draw closer. Ryan turned to face it, his pulse quickening as it came into sharper focus. It was a figure, another person like him, but their features were obscured by the shadows. Their eyes were wide, empty, hollow, like two black holes sucking in the light. The figure's mouth moved, but no sound came from it. It was as if it were trapped in a silent scream, a prisoner of the void, just like Ryan. A cold chill ran down his spine as the figure reached out, its hand stretching toward him. But it wasn't trying to grab him. No, the hand was reaching for something behind him, something in him. Ryan's eyes widened in fear as the figure's fingers brushed against his chest, and suddenly he felt a sharp, cold sensation stab into his heart. It was like the figure had reached into him, through his ribs, through his very soul, and was pulling at something deep within him. He gasped, his chest tightening, as if an invisible hand was squeezing the life out of him. But before he could react, the figure vanished, fading into the darkness, leaving him standing there, trembling. What is this?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "What do you want from me?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, the darkness seemed to pulse, throbbing with a malevolent energy. And then, from the depths of the void, a voice, a familiar voice, spoke. "Ryan, help me." The voice was faint, distant, but Ryan recognized it. It was the voice from the train, the voice of the passenger who had been with him, the one who had warned him. No, this isn't real." Ryan shook his head, trying to block out the voice, but it only grew louder. It was everywhere now, surrounding him, echoing in his ears. "Help me, please." Ryan's breath caught in his throat as the voice grew more frantic. The figure, the one that had been with him on the train, it was still here, trapped in this place, just like the others. He couldn't stop himself. He had to find it. He had to find the source of the voice. He couldn't leave it behind. But the moment he took a step forward, everything shifted. The ground beneath him gave way, and Ryan was falling into the darkness, swallowed by the void. Ryan's body tumbled through the void, weightless and disoriented. His heart raced as the darkness wrapped around him like an endless, suffocating ocean. He could feel himself falling into nothingness, and the cold dread that had been lingering in his chest exploded into full-blown panic. His limbs flailed, grasping at the air, but there was nothing to grab onto, no ground beneath him, no sense of up or down. And then, thud, Ryan hit the ground with a jolt, the impact sending a shockwave of pain through his body. He gasped, the air knocked out of him, but he couldn't catch his breath. The world around him was still dark, but now there was a faint light, a dim, flickering glow, like the last remnants of a dying flame. Ryan groaned as he pushed himself up, his limbs stiff and aching. The moment his hands touched the cold ground, a horrible realization swept over him. The ground wasn't solid, it was soft, damp, like earth soaked with moisture. He hesitated, then forced himself to stand. The faint glow grew stronger, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance along the walls of what now appeared to be a tunnel. A narrow, claustrophobic passage stretching out in front of him. "Help me!" The voice came again, clearer this time. It wasn't the whispering voice from the train. No, this voice was desperate, familiar. "Help me, please." Ryan's heart skipped a beat. He recognized it. It was the voice of the other passenger. The one who had sat across from him on the train. The one who had warned him about Blackwood. He had to find them. He had to. Ryan's thoughts were cut off by a sharp, scraping sound from somewhere ahead, followed by the faintest rustle of movement. His heart leapt into his throat, and he froze. He wasn't alone. Someone was ahead of him in the tunnel. Without thinking, Ryan took a tentative step forward, the flickering light growing closer. The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for him to move through comfortably, but he pressed on, driven by that familiar voice, echoing from the depths of the darkness. And then, just as he thought he might lose the light, he rounded a corner and stopped dead in his tracks. There, ahead of him, stood the passenger from the train. But this wasn't the person he had seen before. No, this was something else, something twisted. The figure was hunched over, its limbs contorted at unnatural angles, as if it had been wrongly assembled. Its face was a grotesque mask of flesh, its eyes wide and empty, sunken deep into its skull. Its mouth hung open in a silent scream, but no sound came out. Ryan's stomach churned as the figure raised its head and locked eyes with him. For a brief moment, he thought he saw recognition in its hollow gaze. Then the figure smiled, a wide, toothless grin that seemed to stretch unnaturally across its face. "Ryan!" The voice came again, raspy and distorted, as if it had been stretched too thin. I'm sorry." The words were barely audible, but Ryan could feel them deep within him. The figure stepped forward, dragging its twisted body across the floor with a sickening, scraping sound. Every step was slow, deliberate, and as it moved closer, Ryan's instincts screamed at him to run. But he couldn't. His feet were frozen to the spot. He was trapped. "Please," the figure whispered again, its mouth barely moving. "Please help me." Ryan didn't know what to do. What could he do? The figure before him was not human. Nothing human could be so twisted, so wrong. His mind raced, trying to make sense of everything, but the weight of the situation was too much. The creature wasn't asking for help, it was begging for release. A release from the same curse that had trapped him here. But there was no way out. Not for either of them. Ryan took a cautious step back, but the figure moved faster than he expected, closing the distance between them in a single, fluid motion. It reached out, its long, gnarled hand grasping for his. Ryan recoiled, stumbling backward, but the creature was too quick. Its fingers brushed against his wrist, cold and clammy, sending a jolt of panic through his body. "Ryan!" The voice was a rasp now, like something caught between life and death. Ryan jerked his hand away, his pulse hammering in his ears. but the creature only smiled wider. The smile was unnerving, wide and grotesque, as if it were trying to smile through pain, through agony. "You're one of them, aren't you?" Ryan gasped, his voice thick with fear. "You're trapped here, just like me." The creature's smile faded, its face contorting with a look that might have been sorrow, or perhaps something worse. It shook its head slowly, the motion jerky and unnatural. "No, Ryan." The voice was soft, almost mournful now. "I wasn't always like this. I was once like you. But now," it gestured to its twisted form, its face, its hands, its body, everything about it a mockery of human shape. "I am one of the lost now, the ones who could never leave, the ones who thought they could escape, but couldn't." Ryan's stomach turned. The pit in his chest deepened. This place was changing him, changing them. It wasn't just a nightmare. It was a curse, a cycle that trapped them in an endless loop of suffering. People like the creature before him, they weren't just dead. They were stuck in the in-between, forever bound to Blackwood. "What is it that you want from me?" Ryan said, his voice trembling. He had to get out of here. He couldn't let this happen to him. He wouldn't. "Nothing from you," the creature rasped. "But you." It stopped suddenly, the words trailing off, as if something had interrupted its thought. It blinked, and when its eyes opened again, it seemed different. Not in appearance, but in presence. It was no longer a twisted figure, but something darker, an echo of itself. "You are one of us now," it whispered, its voice growing distant, hollow. "And you will join us soon. You will be like me, like them." Ryan's breath hitched. He shook his head violently, as if to shake away the suffocating truth that was closing in on him. This place was swallowing him whole, and the train, the last train, had been his ticket here. There was no escape. But even as he struggled against the hopelessness that was slowly choking the life from him, he knew one thing. The last train to Blackwood wasn't just a train. It was a curse, and it had no end. Ryan's legs trembled beneath him as the realization settled like a weight in his chest. The creature, now a distant shadow of its former self, loomed before him, its hollow eyes fixed on him with an eerie intensity. He was sinking deeper into Blackwood, just as the figure had warned. It was already happening. The void was changing him. He wanted to scream, to lash out, but the words caught in his throat. His body felt numb, as if the air itself was thickening around him, growing colder, heavier with each passing moment. Every breath felt like an effort, each inhale dragging him further into the abyss. But he couldn't stay still. He couldn't let himself become like the creature, twisted and broken. Not yet. With a final glance at the shrouded figure, Ryan turned and ran. His footsteps echoed down the narrow tunnel, a rhythmic pounding that seemed to chase him, mocking him. The light ahead was faint but steady, like a distant star. He focused on that light, pushing himself harder, faster, even as the weight of despair threatened to drag him back. The darkness closed in around him, curling like fingers around his body, pressing against his skin. It whispered in 1,000 voices, all speaking at once. "You can't escape. Not from here. Not from Blackwood." But Ryan kept running. The sound of his own heartbeat was deafening in his ears, the rush of blood a reminder that he was still alive, at least for now. He reached the end of the tunnel and stepped into a vast, open space. The light here was brighter, almost blinding, and for a moment, he thought he had found a way out. But as his eyes adjusted, he saw the truth. This place wasn't an escape. It was just another trap. The walls of the space were made of shifting shadows, the edges flickering like a broken film reel. The ground was cracked and uneven, like the remnants of a destroyed city, half swallowed by time. Above him, the sky was a swirling mess of dark clouds, but no rain fell. There was no wind. The air was still, suffocating, and filled with the faint scent of decay. And in the distance he saw it. The train. The last train to Blackwood. It sat there at the far end of the void, just as he had seen it earlier. The empty, rusted vehicle, the same as before, but now it seemed more oppressive, more suffocating. The windows were dark, but Ryan could feel the eyes of the lost souls within. He could feel their gaze on him, watching, waiting. He couldn't go back to that train. He couldn't face it again. But as the realization hit him, a crushing pressure weighed down on his chest. His breath quickened, and his heart hammered in his ears. He had no choice. Slowly, his legs carried him forward, each step heavier than the last. His mind screamed at him to stop, to turn around, but the pull of the train was undeniable. It was like a force, a magnetic presence, drawing him toward it, bending his will to its will. When he reached the train, he hesitated. The doors were ajar, as if waiting for him. He looked inside, but there was nothing. No one. Just empty seats, covered in a thick layer of dust. A voice came from behind him, soft but unmistakable. "Ryan." His body froze. That voice. The voice of the other passenger. "Ryan, it's too late now." The voice was faint, distant, but clear. It was filled with a deep sorrow, a regret that seemed to echo through the very fabric of Blackwood. "You're already one of us." Ryan turned slowly, his eyes scanning the shadows behind him. The figure was there again, but this time it was different. It was no longer twisted, no longer a grotesque mockery of humanity. It stood tall, its form dark but human. Its eyes, once hollow, were now filled with something familiar. "I'm sorry," the figure said, its voice trembling. "I never wanted this for you. But you had to know. You had to understand." Ryan took a step back, his mind racing. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. "It's not too late," he whispered, more to himself than to the figure. "I can still get out. I can still find a way. I can still escape." The figure shook its head slowly. "No, Ryan. You can't escape. Not from Blackwood. No one does." Ryan's heart sank. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, trying to find some way to fight against the crushing weight of reality. His hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms as he fought back the overwhelming wave of despair. There had to be something he could do. There had to be a way to stop this. But as he stood there, staring into the eyes of the figure, into the eyes of someone who had been just like him, just a moment ago, he realized that maybe there was no escape. Maybe there never had been. The figure took a step forward, its face etched with sorrow, and placed a cold, heavy hand on Ryan's shoulder. "I was just like you," it whispered. "I thought I could fight it. I thought I could escape. But you can't. None of us can." Ryan could feel the truth of those words deep within him, like a stone sinking into the pit of his stomach. He wasn't going to make it out. There was no way out. The last train to Blackwood was a one-way ride, and he had boarded it, just like everyone else before him. The figure smiled, though there was no joy in it, only a deep, profound sadness. "Welcome to Blackwood," it said softly. "Now you're one of us." Ryan stood there, feeling the weight of its words settle on his shoulders. He had known it for a while now, hadn't he? He had known that there was no escape from Blackwood. There was no train that could take him back. And now, as he stood on the precipice of oblivion, the truth was clear. He had crossed the threshold. He had entered the in-between, and there was no coming back. Ryan stood still, his breath shallow, his body feeling like it no longer belonged to him. The weight of the figure's hand on his shoulder seemed to anchor him to the moment, pulling him deeper into the reality of Blackwood. The world around him felt wrong, too still, too quiet, like the calm before something catastrophic. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The figure didn't move, and Ryan felt as if the very air had thickened with the weight of the truth between them. Every part of him screamed to fight, to resist, but there was nothing left to fight. The last train had arrived, and he was its newest passenger. "What happens now?" Ryan asked, his voice barely a whisper, trembling with the shock of what he was beginning to understand. "What happens to us?" The figure gave a slow, deliberate shake of its head. "We wait," it said quietly, its voice carrying the hollow emptiness of someone who had long since given up hope. We wait for the next passenger, the next soul to join us. And when they arrive, we show them the truth. Ryan felt a chill run through him. The truth, that there is no way out, the figure said, its voice breaking slightly as it spoke. That Blackwood is not a place you can escape from. Not with your will, not with your mind. It's a place where time is broken, where the line between life and death is nothing but a thin veil that can be torn away at any moment. Everyone who arrives here is lost. And we, it paused, taking a deep breath. We are the ones who couldn't leave. We are the ones who got trapped. The ones who never made it back to where we came from. Now we're all here, stuck in the in-between, forever. Ryan's pulse quickened, the cold dread pooling in his stomach. He looked at the figure, seeing the torment in its eyes. The same torment he could already feel starting to take root within himself. He thought of the train, its cold, empty seats, the twisted windows that framed the dark, shifting landscape outside. He thought of the voice, whispering to him from the shadows. "I don't want this," Ryan muttered, more to himself than to the figure. "I can't be like you. I can't stay here. There has to be a way out. There has to be." The figure let out a low, mournful laugh, the sound hollow and broken. "We all thought that," it said softly. "At first. But Blackwood, it has a way of taking everything from you piece by piece. You'll stop fighting eventually, and when you do, you'll understand. The last train doesn't take you anywhere but here. And once you're here, you'll never leave." Ryan staggered back, his mind whirling, his thoughts a tangled mess. He wanted to scream, to shout, but the words didn't come. Instead, a hollow silence filled the space between them, growing heavier with each passing second. He felt as if the very air were suffocating him, as if Blackwood itself were pulling him deeper into its grip, just as it had done to so many before him. "Then what? What am I supposed to do?" Ryan asked, the words slipping from his lips like a plea. "There's nothing left to do but accept it," the figure said, its voice quiet, resigned. "There's no escaping this place. Not anymore." Ryan's hands trembled, his chest tight with fear, frustration, and hopelessness. His gaze flickered to the train behind him, the decaying vehicle that had brought him here, that had carried him to this cursed place. It stood, silent and ominous, as though it were waiting for him to step back on board, ready to take him deeper into the heart of Blackwood. But then something changed. A soft sound, faint at first but growing louder. Footsteps. Someone was approaching from the direction of the train. Ryan's heart skipped a beat. His eyes shot toward the sound, and he saw a figure emerging from the shadows, moving toward him. It was a person, another passenger. Someone else who had boarded the train, just like him. The figure was tall, its features obscured by the darkness, but Ryan could make out the faint outline of their face. It was a woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, her eyes wide with fear. Her hair was unkempt, tangled, as if she had been wandering this place for a long time. She stopped a few feet from him, her body stiff with tension. She stared at Ryan, her eyes wide and desperate, as though she too had just realized the truth of Blackwood. You're here too," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought I was the last one. The last person. How did you get here?" Ryan could hardly breathe as the weight of her words sank in. She too had been on the last train. She too had been trapped in Blackwood. But unlike him, she had been here long enough to understand the horror of it, to understand the futility of trying to escape. "I don't know," Ryan said, his voice breaking. "I don't know how I got here. I thought the train was just taking me home." She shook her head, her hands trembling. "It never does. It never takes you home." She stepped closer to him, her eyes filled with a strange, almost hollow sympathy. "I've been here longer than you, longer than any of us, and I'm telling you there's no way out. You'll learn soon enough. You'll learn what we all did." Ryan felt the cold grip of despair tighten around his chest. The woman's eyes seemed to pierce into him, as though she could see the fear, the confusion, the hopelessness that had begun to take root inside him. You won't be able to stop it, she whispered, her voice low, almost soothing. You'll start to forget who you were. You'll start to forget where you came from. You'll begin to think this place is all there is. You'll start to believe that Blackwood is your home. Ryan recoiled, his head spinning. He couldn't imagine losing himself, losing his memory of who he was, but the woman's words were like a dark prophecy. He could already feel the pull of Blackwood, the oppressive weight of its presence, sinking into his soul. I won't let it happen, Ryan said, more forcefully this time. I won't stay here. I won't become like you. She smiled sadly, shaking her head again. You don't have a choice. We're all stuck here. The train, Blackwood, it has already claimed us. And soon it will claim you too. Ryan stood frozen in place, his mind racing. The woman's words echoed in his head, each one a nail in his coffin. The truth was sinking in, and it was harder and harder to ignore. He turned toward the train once again, his mind in turmoil. Would it take him deeper into the curse? Or would it leave him stranded here forever, lost and forgotten? But even as he looked, the last train to Blackwood began to move once more, its cold, empty windows staring back at him, waiting for him to step on board. Ryan stood at the threshold of the train, staring at the empty seats inside, each one beckoning him with a silent, insidious invitation. The woman's words had settled deep into his heart, and no matter how he tried to push them away, they gnawed at him. There was no escape. Blackwood wasn't a place, it was a prison, and he had just taken the last train to his own inevitable doom. His heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't bring himself to turn away. He had already crossed the line. The train was no longer a choice, it was his only path forward. The darkness had already begun to weave itself into his soul, and the quiet hum of the train's engine felt like the pulse of Blackwood itself, growing stronger with every passing second. The woman watched him, her eyes filled with a strange mix of pity and resignation. She had seen this happen before. She had been there, just as confused, just as desperate to fight it. But now she was nothing more than a ghost, a shadow of her former self, lost in the void that Blackwood had created. She knew what was coming for him. She knew that soon Ryan would stop fighting. "You'll forget," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "You'll forget the world you came from, the life you had. This place, it will consume you. All of us. Every one of us is just another lost soul wandering in the dark." Ryan swallowed hard, the words tearing at him, but he didn't speak. There was no argument left. There was nothing left to fight. The woman's face softened, and she took a step back, her form fading slowly into the shadows, vanishing into the very darkness she had once feared. Ryan felt it then, the pull of the train, the weight of the place pressing down on him, urging him to move, to step inside. His legs felt heavy like lead, but his feet moved, dragging him forward. One step, then another, and another. The air was thick with silence as he climbed aboard, his body trembling with a mixture of fear and surrender. He found an empty seat and sank into it, the cold leather biting against his skin. The train lurched to life, the sound of its engine starting up a low, ominous hum that seemed to resonate in his bones. The doors closed behind him with a dull, final thud, and the train began to move. Outside the windows, the landscape shifted once again. The city lights, the familiar buildings, the roads he had once known, all of it began to fade, swallowed by an impenetrable darkness. The train was no longer bound to any real destination. It was floating, moving through nothingness, through the in-between, a place where time had no meaning and nothing was certain. Ryan glanced around. The other passengers were gone. The train was empty again, except for him. He was alone. But he wasn't alone. Not really. The echoes of the woman's voice still lingered in his mind. "You'll forget. You'll become like us." He closed his eyes, trying to block out the sound of the train's monotonous rumble. But as the seconds stretched into minutes, and the minutes into hours, he could feel it. He could feel himself starting to slip. His thoughts, his memories, they began to blur, like water running through his fingers. Faces, names, places, all of it was slowly dissolving into the cold darkness outside the train, disappearing into the void. Ryan's body went numb. He didn't want to forget. He didn't want to lose himself, but already it was happening. The pull of Blackwood was too strong. He could feel it deep inside of him like a seed of doubt, a gnawing emptiness that was slowly consuming him piece by piece. His mind wandered, losing track of time. The train continued its journey through the endless black void, and Ryan's eyes grew heavy. His eyelids fluttered, then closed completely. He was drifting. He didn't even notice when the train stopped. When Ryan opened his eyes again, he didn't know how much time had passed. His head was pounding, his limbs stiff and heavy. He looked around, disoriented. The train was stopped, and the door in front of him was open. There was no noise, no sound of the engine, only the silence that had swallowed everything. He stood up slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. The empty seat stared back at him, but something had changed. There was a faint flicker of movement in the corner of his vision, a shadow darting just beyond the reach of the dim light. Ryan stepped toward the door, his heart racing in his chest. As he passed through, he found himself standing on the platform of a station he didn't recognize. The station was dark, deserted, and silent, like a place forgotten by time itself. But then he heard the sound. It was faint at first, just a whisper on the wind, but it grew louder, clearer. A low, agonized moan, as if something or someone was suffering. Ryan turned his head, following the sound. And there, in the darkness, he saw them. The other passengers. The ones who had been lost, just like him. Their eyes were hollow, their bodies twisted and broken. They stood motionless, staring at him with a blank, lifeless gaze. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. They were waiting for him. "Welcome back," a voice whispered from the shadows. It was the voice of the woman, now no longer human, her features barely recognizable. "You're one of us now." Ryan felt the weight of her words settle into his chest. He wanted to scream, to run, but there was nowhere to go. The station, the platform, the train, they were all a part of Blackwood now, a place where no one could ever truly leave. And then, with a chilling certainty, Ryan understood. He was no longer a man. He was a lost soul, doomed to wander the endless, empty corridors of Blackwood forever. The train had taken him home, but it had brought him to a home he would never escape. As the fog settled and the whispers faded, Ryan knew that his story, like those before him, would be lost to the endless night. And that's the end of tonight's stories. Keep listening to the sound of rain and fall into a deep, peaceful sleep.